Hi, my name is Shanjini, and my partner is Victoria, and we're going to be talking about the different types of burial ceremonies and their meanings. And I'll be starting off by talking about the history of ceremonies. So, what is an actual burial? It's really just an act of placing a corpse of a dead person into a tomb that is basically constructed for that specific purpose, or it's usually a grave dug into the earth, and it all really depends on the culture. And the burial rites, it also depends on the culture, but burial rites will include some type of ceremony or a sacred place for the dead or even a memorial for the dead. So burial rites through time. It starts off with 60,000 BC, and in between 60,000 BC and 2014, there's other time eras, but for 60,000 BC is when the Neanderthals used flowers and antlers to decorate their dead. And up to 2014, we now have customized cremation urns that began to be made with 3D printers. So our journal article that we submitted to tie in our topic was titled "Do Funerals Matter? The Purposes and Practices of Death Rituals in a Global Perspective." So William G. Hoy, he wrote a book that studied different types of funeral ceremonies in over 135 cultural groups. And Paul Metzler, he wrote this article summarizing it all up. So in Hoy's book, he mentioned these 5 core components of death customs that I feel like played a really important role to tie in burial ceremonies as a whole. And these 5 core components was the use of significant symbols, gathering the community, engaging in ritual action, connection to a cultural heritage, and respectful disposal of the body. So the first type of burial method we decided to talk about was cremation, and we involved the religion Hinduism. So the process of cremation was just the burning of a human body until all the soft parts were destroyed by the fire. So the ashes, they were spread out in the Ganges River in India, and the fire symbolized purity and power. And that was just to scare away harmful ghosts, demons, and spirits that they believed in. After talking with my parents and just kind of seeing it on TV, I guess, there's usually an eldest male relative that will be holding like a stick of fire, and he'll be like circling the pyre either 3 times, sprinkling holy water, or usually sometimes it's not even 3, it's sometimes more, until the priest says like it's okay that you're done now. So when to hold a cremation funeral is by usually the next dusk or dawn. And again, the priest should be contacted to perform these mantras or rites. So why the custom of cremation? They believed in the method of purification, that's why they did cremation. They also believe that it releases the soul from a polluted body, or that it even symbolizes the transitory nature of life, of destruction and rebirth. Even it eliminates the body as a health risk, and also simple, the body does not take up valuable land. Preparing the body for cremation, the family members or the close friends will usually wash the body, either with purified water, and what I found really interesting was that they might even use a mixture of milk, yogurt, ghee, and honey. So with the body, the big toes are also tied together. The hands are placed palm to palm position as if you were like praying. The body is clothed in white, and so are the family members and friends. They are also clothed in white. And the body is placed on the pyre that is built, which is usually made out of sticks. Mummification is the next burial method we chose to do, and this includes the Chincharo people and ancient Egyptians. So mummification is just the regular method of artificial preservation. With preparing the body, it was kind of different between the Chincharo people and ancient Egyptians. So with the Chincharo people, they removed the organs and cleaned the body cavities. And as they cleaned the body cavities, they packed these bodies with clay. And they painted the bodies black from head to toe. And they even placed wigs on their heads. And what was really interesting was that they left the eyes and mouth open. With ancient Egyptians, they held the mummification remains in canopic jars, as displayed in the picture. The jars usually contained like the liver, the guts, the lungs, the stomach, the intestines, stuff like that. The heart they left inside the body because they believed in afterlife, and so they weighed to whether the person had a good life or not. So why the custom of mummification is again because to preserve the body for the afterlife, which is why they left the heart inside the body. And to reach the afterlife, the dead person would have to repossess his or her body.
Okay, hi, my name is Victoria, and we'll be talking about Catholic burials now. Catholic burials, there are three principal rituals associated with them. One is the vigil, which is more commonly known as the wake. The second is the funeral liturgy, and then three, rite of committal, which is the burial or interment. The vigil can take place at a church, the deceased home, or funeral home. And in the wake, devotional prayers are offered to the deceased. Family and friends gather to say goodbye and support the mourners. During a funeral liturgy, there's two parts. One is the funeral mass, which is led by a priest. The mass affirms the union of the church on earth with the church in heaven. And scriptures, hymns, and prayers are read. The funeral liturgy, which is a service, some people may choose to celebrate this as an alternative to Mass, can be celebrated outside or in conjunction with Mass. The rite of committal, which is the burial or interment, occurs at the grave, mausoleum, or crematorium. It's the conclusion of the Catholic funeral, and mourners express hope that the deceased awaits resurrection. The beliefs and traditions associated with Catholic burials include the sacrament of anointing of the sick. In this, the priest reads an individual their last rites before death occurs, and after death occurs, embalming is often used to preserve the body for when they put it in the casket. Cultural beliefs, some families may choose to forego the Catholic funeral rites being read for the deceased. However, this is viewed as improper practice in the Catholic religion. Spiritual and religious beliefs, Catholics believe that death equals the end of their earthly pilgrimage, and funerals may not be held on certain days such as Holy Thursday, Good Friday, etc. Their remains should be buried in the ground at sea or entombed, not scattered. Bodies are usually left intact to await resurrection, and cremation has been recently accepted in the Catholic faith, but is still not very common. Now onto Navajo burial ceremonies. Some of the traditional beliefs associated with them is the bitter herb, which is used to cleanse impurities, which we'll talk about later how that plays into the burial process. Cultural beliefs, typically death is taboo in the Navajo culture. It is not talked about. Pregnant women are not allowed at funerals, for which we'll find out why later. And athletes typically will not come to a burial site because they believe that the ground will harm their legs. Spiritual beliefs. Water is offered to grave sites. Water is very sacred in the Navajo culture, and they often pray to water and then offer it. They also pray for their deceased to go to what is known as the House of Corn Pollen, which the Navajo people believe was where they were created, the creation of the Navajo people. Corn pollen, as we see in the picture on the right, is very sacred. They use it to pray with 3 times daily. It's used for protection, used for good luck, and is buried with their deceased. Some history of Navajo burial ceremonies. Before the 1940s, their burial ceremonies were a little different than modern day. I'll just go through it real quickly. Basically, what happened after death after the death of a Navajo individual, a medicine man would come to their house, or a hogan. The body would be wrapped in a hand-woven blanket. The house of the deceased would be abandoned and would not be lived in ever again. Prayer would be offered. All the belongings of the deceased would be burned, because the Navajo people believe that burning the belongings, they burn their belongings because they believe they will exist in the afterlife if they do. Family members are forbidden to touch the deceased. Individuals are buried in their finest clothing and jewelry, and grave sites were not revisited. Also, that is why, an interesting fact, because Navajo people were often buried in their finest clothing and jewelry, they do not have many family heirlooms a lot of the time. And also they believe that it is forbidden to touch the body, because if a living person touches the body of the deceased, a part of their soul will stay with the deceased and enter the spirit world. To prevent this, they use a cleansing with a bitter herb if they do come in contact with the deceased at any point. Moving on to modern day Navajo burial ceremonies. Typically they happen in a hospital nowadays. However, only RNs are allowed to care for Navajo patients who are dying. And after the person dies, they open a window so their spirit can leave. And the family says goodbye to the deceased. However, once again, they're not allowed to touch them. Their body is sent to a funeral home typically, or the family might choose to bring it home with them and bury it themselves. Embalming is not widely practiced because they believe they should keep the bodily fluids they were born with themselves. At the funeral service, prayers, songs, and eulogy are offered. Typically they have ground burials or cremation. Once again, they're buried in their finest clothing. The pallbearers are all male. They dig the gravesite and cover it. Afterwards, they cleanse themselves with the bitter herb after. No matter what they touch, because they touch the headstone, the dirt, anything, they have to cleanse themselves with the bitter herb. Pregnant women are forbidden to attend the burial ceremony because they believe it will harm the mom and expectant baby. The father of the deceased is forbidden to look at the body. The body is buried with the feet facing east and head facing west, because they believe that the thoughts and prayers begin in the east, and then the day also begins in the east. Children are encouraged not to attend the ceremony, but they're welcome to the reception afterwards. After the burial service, once again, like in the old days, their belongings are gathered and burned. Prayers are offered throughout the entire ceremony, and they pray for their loved one to go to the house of corn pollen. At the reception, words of encouragement are offered, and the Navajo people really take this as a learning experience. For example, if the death was an unexpected or tragic one, they like to share with their community what could have been done to have prevented that death, so it does not happen again. And revisiting of grave sites is allowed in modern day, and they offer water to the gravesite. Now on to Jewish burial ceremonies. Their traditional beliefs include they give consideration and respect to the dead. The rite of Kira is a rending of the garment. Clothing is torn and worn during a mourning period. Funerals are non-ostentatious, so flowers and music would be inappropriate. There is no embalming or wake done, and the casket is made of wood because they believe in the saying ashes to ashes, dust to dust. So they wouldn't use like a non-biodegradable material. Also, cremation is forbidden and autopsies are generally avoided. Cultural beliefs, the community supports the grieving family. After death, the body retains its sanctity, and a holy society which helps the family observe funerals and make sure that the deceased will have a proper Jewish burial according to tradition. That society is called the Hevra Kadisha, and burial ceremonies are not held on certain days such as Shabbat or the holy day. After death occurs, a rabbi is consulted. Once again, that organization is established, the Hevra Kadisha. Funeral directors are consulted and picked. However, they must be approved to do Jewish traditional burial. Burial must occur within the first 24 hours of death or as soon as possible. The funeral is held in a synagogue, which we see on the right. Casket is covered with a type of cloth called a pall, and the pallbearers must stop 7 times during the ceremony. The mourners will follow the casket, and as the casket is buried, they use a method of reverse shoveling, and each time a member shovels, they must stick it in the ground before another person can pick it up and take it out. The Kaddish is recited, and after the ceremony, mourners pass between 2 rows of people to express condolences.
So the physical aspect to nursing is usually just when the nurse would give a patient a bath, clean them up, cover their wounds, stuff like that. The position they would put them in would just kind of be like straighten up the legs, tuck the arms at the sides, put a clean sheet over them, make sure their eyes are closed. Also making sure the hands are available so the family can reach out to them, and just cleaning up the room and making sure all their tags are in the correct and in place. The spiritual aspect to nursing includes palliative care nurses. They're mostly just there to offer a support system to the patients until death, and it also helps the family cope during their dying process. Some examples would just be like being with the patients in their experiences of suffering and just kind of being comforting towards them and listening to them and stuff like that. The cultural aspect is kind of just like when the nurse has to acquaint themselves with the patient's rituals and the faith just to serve the patient to the best of ability. And some example is like the Jewish patient example. Candles are lit in the room. They can't touch the body until the rabbi has arrived. And usually a son or a relative usually closes the eyes and mouth of the deceased and washes and dresses the body.
The psychosocial aspects of burial and the death are some cultural examples. For example, we mentioned that Navajo people cannot touch the deceased, and if they do, they must cleanse themselves with the bitter herb. A registered nurse is only allowed to care for the patient, so an LPN wouldn't be able to. Communication is very important because the patient and their family will be having anxiety over this dying process. So it is very important to communicate with them using therapeutic communication. Pain management is also important, administering medication to patients who are dying and in pain, and also teaching patients alternative pain management techniques. A nurse's own beliefs also play into this, depending on their culture. For example, Navajo nurses may have a conflict with performing CPR because if that patient dies, then they have touched a deceased person. So if that happens, Navajo nurses will carry a bitter herb around with them just in case, so they can cleanse themselves afterwards in case the patient dies.
And that's all we have for you guys.
Yes.
We hope you guys learned a lot of information.
Yes, and here are references.